Okay, this is a little bit of Q&A with Dr. Carleen DeBlaere. We've got one side of the conversation, so this is going to be a little bit like Jeopardy. I'm going to listen to her response and then guess the question. So the first little bit here is a little bit of intro.
Thank you so much, Aman, for the lovely introduction. I think you covered all the things. Those are my interests, kind of broadly multicultural, social justice and research, and practice and training. And let's see. And yes, I am the training director, but depending on if you look at APA, I'm the training director. Georgia State calls it the program coordinator. I also hold a couple of other positions. I'm the past chair for the division on Asian American and Pacific Islander people with multiple heritages. I just stepped or rotated off of being the VP for diversity and public interest for the Division 17. I will start as the rep to the APA, the council rep, in January for Division 17, and there was something else that kind of happened somewhat recently, but I don't remember. Anyway. We keep busy, so you all are moving into potentially careers that you'll have lots of opportunities to try lots of different things, which is kind of fun. So I'm really excited to talk with you all today and having good conversation.
Okay, this second question is about what are the expectations you have of doctoral students on your team?
Okay, so what do I expect? Well, it actually kind of varies. So you tell me, I'll answer the question, or a version of the question, and you can tell me, Liz, whether or not, please feel free to ask follow-up questions. Let me see. Okay. I hear an echo too. Sorry if I don't know what that's coming from. Okay. So what do I expect of doctoral students? It actually somewhat varies, and what I mean by that is I will have meetings with all of my doctoral students right when they start, and I'll ask them, what is it that you're hoping to do? I understand, goals will shift and change, but with that being said, for right now, kind of what you think your goals might be, and then we kind of have a plan of what, maybe start to map out, certainly at least their first year. But in terms of, general qualities, I think I expect, or, I like when students are, kind of all the things you'd expect. Responsible, invested. I think one of the things that I look for in a student is passion. So a passion for what it is that they do. Because I feel like skills you can teach, but things like passion or strong investment in work, in the work that you're going to do is something, I can't develop intrinsic motivation. And I think the other thing is I'll say for me personally, the students that I tend to work with are students who tend, they're working with me because they have a shared interest, and so their topics are invariably diversity focused or social justice focused. Oftentimes they're interested in working with marginalized groups, and that's not easy work. It's not easy work to do research on because you're reading a lot of stuff that sometimes can be really, I think the experience of marginalized folks. Although I think there's so much strength and there's so much, so many of you mentioned strength and resilience, so much of that within communities that have been oppressed, but there's also, just a lot of stuff. There's a lot of really negative things. There's a lot of health disparity. So I think I think having a deeper connection to that, a passion for that, can help to sustain students in their training. A responsiveness to feedback, I think, is a really good quality. And it doesn't mean that, you get feedback and you absolutely have to say, take it all in and think, I think I appreciate when my students are able to be thoughtful about the feedback that they receive. But I think initially being able to take in feedback and consider it, and then we can have conversation about it. I think, and I don't think that's just me. I think as a doctoral student, you're going to get a lot of feedback. You're going to get written feedback on your writing. You're going to get feedback about how you are as a counselor. There's just going to be a lot of feedback. And I think being able to kind of sit with feedback and, and kind of in a non-defensive way is actually a pretty critical skill for a doctoral student. I think the other stuff like learning to write, learning to think critically, those are things that we can, teach. I think being collegial is really helpful, like being a person who, with strong interpersonal skills. Again, it doesn't mean that you have to like get along with every single person, but I think generally having qualities where you're able to engage and be respectful of others, I think is really helpful. So, I don't know. So so on my team, I appreciate if you're a team player. I appreciate your interest in helping others, particularly the students who are newer, that we kind of help each other and take newer students kind of under our wing and help to mentor them not only within the research team, but also in the program more broadly. So those are kind of the first things that come to mind. But Liz, does that answer your question? Are there more specific things?
Thanks for that, Carleen. Okay, our next question is about timeline for different research requirements.
Yeah, great questions. In terms of like pre-dis, and this wouldn't just be at Georgia State, most programs want you to do a thesis or pre-dis within the first 2 years of your program. So having it done by the end of your second year is kind of the timeline that most programs have. It's not unusual to go into your third year, the beginning of your third year. I actually did that myself. But generally speaking, there would be that expectation. I mean, so there are some, kind of milestone things by your second year, you ideally, you want to have your pre-dis done, then you go into you take your comprehensive exams is kind of the next big thing. And after comprehensive exams, you do your dissertation prospectus. And so you kind of propose your dissertation, internship applications, and then defend dissertation. So those are kind of the bigger things.
Okay, next question. What sort of balance of research and practice are you looking for in your doctoral students?
So where do I fall between research versus clinical in my own work, and where do you expect your students to fall? Okay. So I probably, in being a tenure track faculty member, fall more in the research than the clinical. I think where I've been fortunate is that I've been able to be one of the clinical supervisors for the first year for students in their first practicum, and that's allowed me to stay connected to clinical work in that way. I have done kind of, all of my postdoctoral hours, but in terms of doing clinical work primarily, or even on this other than doing kind of clinical work in terms of training, that isn't something that I'm doing primarily now. And part of that is I kind of made, as a tenure track faculty member at an R1, being licensed isn't really something you need to be. So there are a lot of faculty who are not necessarily licensed. And that would include me. So I have my postdoctoral hours, but haven't taken the licensure exam, although that's a personal goal, and I'm actually studying for it now. So I think for me, now that I have tenure and I'm kind of in a different space, I actually really enjoy clinical work. I always have. There's something I think really I've always found clinical work there's aspects of it that are, I think, really powerful. And there are moments that you can share with folks in clinical work that I totally understand, and probably all of you having done some clinical work. Psychotherapy work research is really hard to do. And part of the reason I think it is because if you tried to break down all the things that you did in therapy, it would be kind of hard. Like in those moments when you get into a flow with a client, like how would you quantify that? Like how would you? So there's a part of that that I think is really, really special. So right now I probably fall in research. As a graduate student, I was probably in the middle. I enjoyed both, and I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. So I did a lot of research and I did a lot of clinical work, and I kind of figured it would work itself out in the end. In terms of where do I expect my students to fall, I actually don't have expectations about that. I think it's really important to train clinicians, and it's important to train folks who might want to do a career that's primarily research or teaching. I think all of those things are really important. I think they're all ways to kind of impact communities. And so for me, it's less about what I want for students and more about what it is that they want for themselves. And then what can I do to help them to get there? So if they're primarily wanting to do clinical work, which, I have graduates who do that or work in community mental health, like it was really about what could be the clinical experiences that would help them to get the job that they wanted. And then also, could we do research projects that would potentially be able to inform their work, whether the population that they were wanting to work with or maybe a presenting concern or concerns. So it really is what the students want more than what it is that I would want.
Carleen, how would you describe your mentoring style?
Yes, that's a great question. I feel like Iman actually, and I won't do this necessarily to Iman and put her on the spot, but I feel like this is a question that I get a lot, and I oftentimes forward it to doctoral students that I currently have. So my personal requirements and standards, maybe I kind of got that. And then in terms of my mentoring style, well, I'll tell you what I aspire to, and and I hope that I achieve more times than I don't. So in terms of my mentoring style, I think I'm probably a little bit more interpersonal than some. So in terms of like what I think the ways in which mentoring relationships can look is there's a huge spectrum. And so I think I probably have more of a personal relationship with my students than not to say that all faculty don't have personal relationships, but I probably am, I'm a very relational person. So I engage my students in relational ways. And so, I think like a long time ago, it kind of be like mentoring the whole student was kind of like a catchphrase that kind of was there. But for me, I think a part of it is, I tend to mentor students who are interested in working with marginalized groups, and that also has tended to translate in most of my students have marginalized identities, at least, and usually multiple. And I think academia can be a hard spot for folks with marginalized identities. Not only in terms of the curriculum, but I think there's something to be said for when there aren't even a lot of people that look like you who are in positions of power, or, there aren't necessarily, or hold your identities. I think it can be hard to feel like it's a space where you belong and where that's for you. And I don't know that it's always a space that is hospitable, but I think my goal is to create a space, at least within our team, where it's like you belong here. And that over time, that's how we change. One way that we can change academia and change psychology training is to have more folks to diversify the field, both in terms of academics and people in academic settings, but also in practice settings. And so that's a long way of kind of saying, I know for me, I probably, with different kind of imposter feelings, I was the first Asian student in my doctoral program, so I felt a lot of pressure to represent. So I think there are just a lot of unique challenges. Maybe there's also unique strengths, but I think creating spaces where students can feel supported is important. So I think my mentoring style is more relational. In terms of the work, apprenticeship, I would say, and also very collaborative. So I do ask students kind of, what is your style? What would be most helpful to you? And I try to work within that. And because I'm not probably the most structured person. So, if a student needs that, then I will try to accommodate that. And then also, I would say, certainly in the beginning, more oversight in the beginning, and then kind of progressively more independence of the student as time goes on are the kind of things that I would say.
Are there any questions that you feel like students might forget to think about when they're considering doctoral programs?
One thing that comes to mind is, we really, really emphasize the match between advisor and advisee when applying. I imagine you all have heard that. And it's so important. But one thing I would say is go ahead and take a look at the other faculty, partially because faculty leave. Faculty will move institutions, and sometimes they're able to take their students with them. And also, depending on where you are in your training, you may or may not want to leave your program. You may be partnered. You may have family in the area. You may, financial reasons, what have you. And you're going to need to be mentored by somebody else in the program. And so when I came to Georgia State, I brought a student with me, but that actually sometimes that is just not even, sometimes that's not possible. And so, I've certainly heard a lot of situations where a student was, their advisor left and they had a hard time, faculty are invested in all the students that we accept. And I think that's true across programs. But if there's nobody else on the faculty who has any interest that would even tangentially be able to help you. Your previous advisor maybe could stay on as a dissertation co-chair or what have you, but you just don't know. And so just, take a look at the other faculty and say, okay, and it probably won't happen, but just in case, if a faculty member were not to stay for the duration of your training, would there be at least another person you could foresee okay, they probably, have some interest in the area or would be able to support me in my goals. So that's something. So usually if you can find a program that has maybe even more than one person that might be able to support your training, I think that's a good thing to think about. I think all the other things are probably things that right? So if you have the opportunity to visit programs, to the extent possible, get a sense of how students engage one another, what the climate is like, those kind of things. But in terms of things that people forget to consider, that probably is that was the first thing that came to mind.
Here's a good one. Why counseling psych as opposed to other subfields in psychology or counselor education and practice?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll be honest. When I applied to counseling psychology programs and I applied to clinical psychology programs. And that was because the programs that I had trained in, I was in psychology departments that didn't have counselor education programs. And so I actually learned more about counselor education once I was in graduate school. And I think there's a lot about counselor education that's great and probably could have been a fit for me. But in terms of what made me pick counseling psychology versus other programs, I really was primarily looking at an applied area. So that left me with counseling psychology, school psychology, and clinical psychology, as far as I knew at the time. So I didn't want to necessarily be doing primarily assessments. So that kind of, and being in schools. So schools psych wasn't necessarily a fit for me. And then clinical could have been a fit. The places that I applied, so I applied to half counseling programs and half clinical programs. The clinical programs were very medical. There was a very medical model to that experience. And although there were parts of that, I could appreciate in a certain way, it just didn't feel as good of a fit. At that time, I was really interested, in particular, I was interested in race, ethnicity. I was interested in racism. I was interested in racial identity development. I still am, but like at that time, those were kind of the things that I was looking for. I was looking for kind of folks who were interested in kind of oppression and mental health disparities. And a lot of the folks doing that work were counseling psychologists. There were some clinical psychologists, but I also just had some funky, to be quite honest, I had some funky interview experiences with clinical programs too, where I think I had faculty who just like were debating me about the like relevance of culture and the consideration of culture and identities and cultural identities in the clinical work. Which is, I think, kind of a little bit more of a medical model. And I remember, I was fine. And actually, I was happy to debate folks. But I was thinking, do I want 5 to 7 years of having to debate my professors about the things that I care about? Maybe not so much. So in terms of like when I was thinking about places and the places to accept, I ended up going with the final lists for me were counseling psychology programs for that reason primarily. And then a PhD in counseling psychology or a PhD in psychology opened up a lot of doors in terms of like, I could do consulting if I wanted. I could do private practice if I wanted. I could work in, a clinic if I wanted. I could, be I wasn't really thinking of academia then, but like I could teach, so it just seemed like I was creating a lot of opportunities to still have some space to figure out exactly what I wanted to do longer term. I just wanted to add one thing, Iman, because I know you said that a number of students were thinking about counselor ed, and I just wanted to speak to that real quickly. For me, a delineation of counselor education to like a counseling psych degree or a clinical psych degree is your goal really is to train counselors. So you plan to go into academia because the license that you practice with is you're going to be a licensed mental health counselor. There's not another degree. Like as a psychologist, you're licensed at the PhD level. As a counselor educator, you're licensed at the master's level. So your practitioner license doesn't shift. The reason to get the PhD is because you want to be a professor and you want to train counselors. If that's not necessarily what you want to do, that would maybe be something to consider. So I just wanted to add that. I didn't want to leave out the counselor education piece.
Thanks, Carleen. Can you talk a little bit about the training process and what it involves?
In terms of the license, let's see. Which years do you take courses, practicum, all of that? So having, been in one program and teaching in two, one of the things I'll say is the general format is pretty much the same. So you tend to do a lot more coursework in your first couple years. You'll start practicum in either your first or second year, depending on program and depending on your degree. And then, thesis or your predis is usually occurs within your first 2 years. You usually take your doctoral comprehensive, or some places call it your doctoral qualifying exam, sometime in your third year. Some people take it sometimes in their fourth year, but usually in your third year. Fourth year, if you'll start to work on your dissertation. If you're on a 5-year track, work on your dissertation and apply for internship that fall. And then you do internship in your 5th year. In terms of, so those are kind of the years breakdown, Wendy, in terms of when you do things. You might still take courses periodically here and there, but generally speaking, courses more heavy in the beginning, and then you can do practicum. In terms of the number of practicum, that again depends on your interest and where you want to go. Also, the practicum sites you would go to would really depend on your interests and kind of where you see yourself going for internships. So, for example, if you want an internship at a VA, you definitely should do a practicum at a VA. If you're interested in doing a consortium or something in a hospital, you should probably have assessment experiences, so things like that. I think, in terms of number of hours, you'll hear all kinds of like a huge range of hours. People will be like, you need like 1,500 direct hours. You do not need 1,500 direct hours, okay? But depending on where you go, you might want more or less. But generally speaking, everybody tries to get around 500 direct hours at a minimum just to make themselves competitive for different sites, certainly. A lot of counseling psych students end up going to counseling centers. There's a long history of counseling psychology and counseling centers kind of working and integrating their training. So there's just like a nice... there's just a nice relationship there in terms of emphasis on training. And certainly any counseling psychology program would prepare you for that. And let me see. So I answered that question. Oh, in terms of licensure, so having just submitted all of my things and been working on that for some time, the good thing about graduating, and one of the reasons why you want to apply if you're going to go into a psychology and applied psychology program to an APA accredited program, is that most licensing boards, like all licensing boards, recognize APA accredited programs. So if you go to an APA accredited program, they pretty much trust that to be accredited, you have to maintain a certain standard of training. So they kind of assume you're kind of getting the things that you need. That being said, there are certain states in the United States, if that's where you're going to practice, that have additional requirements. So, for example, the state of California actually has a number of classes. You have to take a class on human sexuality. You have to take a class on, I think, substances. You have to take a class on older adults. So, like, certain states are like that. But for the most part, I'd say, like, at least 40, if not more, of the states. If you graduated from an APA accredited program, in terms of your training, it's there. And then what ends up happening is you will have you'll do your pre-doctoral internship, and you'll get approximately, I think it's like 2,000 hours of time. It's basically 1 year of employment. And then most states require you to get somewhere around 1,500 additional hours to apply, of postdoctoral hours to apply for licensure. Now, that's not every state, okay? So some states are starting to count pre-doc hours as that. So, it varies state by state. But in terms of your training, any APA accredited program will set you up very well for licensure.
Here's another good one. What are some of the differences in supervision between counseling psychology and counselor education and practice?
Great questions. Yeah. So interestingly, I actually did a supervision class for counselor ed, which was kind of, which was actually a very fun experience. So in terms of how, and also knowing the folks who do clinical supervision for counselor ed, I actually don't think what supervision looks very different, actually. So in practice, I think it looks very similar. The main difference is that piece that you noted around credentialing. So, as a psychology student in a counseling psychology doctoral APA accredited program, a certain number of your hours, and pretty much most of your hours, ideally, of supervision hours are done with a licensed psychologist. So that is kind of the difference. And I think with counselor ed, it might be, you want somebody who has an LPC and has a certain number of a certain amount of credentialing related to supervision. But psychology, that's the primary thing. You might be in a hospital, you might be elsewhere, and they'll specifically ask this on your licensure application as well. How many of your hours were done by a licensed psychologist, and how many of your supervision hours were done by somebody who was licensed in something else or not licensed at all? But that's the big deal, is the credentialing that you indicated.
What are some of the most important factors that you would want prospective students to consider when they're trying to decide on a doctoral program?
Yeah, that's such a good question. It seems like such a fundamental question, but there's a reason it's a fundamental question. So what do I think are the most important factors? The reason I hesitate isn't because I don't think that there are important factors. It's just, I think it's really hard to be making a decision of this magnitude, that's going to be the next, 5 to 7 years feasibly of your life. And the best you can do is the best you can do. You can make the best decision with what you know of yourself and kind of your interests now. But I think, as much as you know yourself when you're applying, what are the things that are important to you? So for example, some folks would be like, I need to be close to social support. Like that would be critical for me. And so thinking about yourself, Kiana, and all of you, but thinking about like, what are the things that are going to help you to do well? And is it, feeling like you have a strong relationship with an advisor? Is it, the location? So some folks are like, I can't go to, a grad program in the middle of Idaho. Like that wouldn't work for me, and other people would be like, it would be okay. Actually, that would be totally fine. So like, really is about fit, and, the best you can do is the best you can do in terms of figuring that out. But thinking about like, you can make a whole wish list of the things that are important to you, but what are the top 3? Like, what are the top 3 things, that are important to you? Is it the fit with your advisor? Is it, the other thing I would say, actually, this I will say, if you, don't necessarily want to go into academia, don't pick a program that's like super hardcore research. That's not going to feel good. If you know that you want to be you're really into clinical work, find a program that lists themselves as balanced at the very least. And some programs will say, actually, we train a lot of practitioners, and that's great. If you know that you want to or you're fairly certain like academia is at least something you want to consider, okay, pick a program where there's more of a research focus. Like I will say, I think that's helpful, because I think if you're in a program that feels really, really mismatched in that regard, I'm not saying you won't, you can still do great and you can still do fine. I just think parts of that can be a little bit harder. The other thing is, for me, like, I remember thinking there's not a whole lot that I can't deal with like for 5 years. So like there was, even when something was like hard, I was like, this will end. So I put that in there to kind of say, it is a big decision and it'll be okay. Like you'll, whatever happens, like you can figure out, like, eye on the prize in terms of like what is your goal. And I think that's helpful, knowing what your goal is and what you hope to do with your degree.
Yes. During the interview process, are there any tough questions that you would suggest that students prepare for when they're getting ready for on-campus interviews?
Ones that people struggle with. There are probably a couple. I think one question is when I ask people what their research interests are, there's huge variability on how people are able to answer that question. And when I say people struggle, that might be too strong. When I say there's huge variability, there's some folks who will say something like, I'm interested in working with oppressed groups. And then we sit with each other. No, I'm just kidding. But like, it's a very, that's really great. And I have no sense of what your grasp of the literature is based on that response. I have no sense of if you've done any research that it doesn't even have to apply to that you've done any thinking about how you want to approach studying or working with folks with oppressed identities. That answer doesn't give me a lot. Like, I don't know much about you or know much about how much you've thought about things based on that. Does that make sense? Whereas I'll have other students who've said, I'm really interested in the impact of multiple forms of discrimination and mental health. And actually, I've been really interested in how personal agency might impact that relation, and I read this paper. So one thing I'll say is we love when you've read a paper. And you don't have to read 20 papers, even say, there was this paper that I really liked and this is why. Because it shows, just saying that shows you have an interest, you went and looked at some literature related to that interest, you read the article, and you have enough engagement with the article and the material to then recount to me what felt important. So you basically did a critical analysis. Those are the things we want in a doctoral student. We want you to ask a question, have curiosity about it, go get information about it, and then critically analyze that information. And in that response, somebody's been able to tell me a lot, and that's exciting. Another question students struggle with is like, what's an area of growth? And I will say, and this is totally fine to say this answer, most will say, I do too much. I like to do a lot. And, I don't know, this is actually a reasonable answer, but like, and I would say I'm telling you almost the safest answer. I do a lot. And I probably could work on saying no. Like that's because I would say most doc students are overachievers and they could all have that response. But students sometimes will, just not know an answer. So just think about that one. When you think about like areas for growth. And then let's see, any other questions? Oh, people always have a hard time answering, what do you want to do with your degree in 5 years? Mostly because why would you know that? But it's almost kind of like a projective test is like how, so I will say that a lot of questions that we ask you, some of them, the research one we want concrete answer to, but some of the other questions are more how in times of like in a stressful, which is an interview is an inherently stressful process. How do you engage questions that there's not a right answer, So I think just be authentic. But some of these questions you could think about, right? Like, what would be areas for growth? What do you hope to be able to do with your degree? Where do you see yourself in 5 years? Those are pretty typical questions that you're going to get. And having some sense of what that is I think would be good.
Last but not least, what's it like for you to try to strive for work-life balance within academia?
Yeah, I so appreciate that question, Hannah. Thank you for asking it. It is a work in progress, to be quite honest. I will say this. I don't define myself by my job. And so I feel super privileged to have a job that gives me financial stability, and a job that allows for me to, in some ways, have a good amount of autonomy in how I spend my time. So super privileged in those ways. Certainly like any job, there's challenges, but those things I'm particularly grateful for. But yeah, like, this might feel kind of morbid. At the end of my life, I'm not going to say like I wrote 100 papers, like, and that felt really like, I feel like, it's probably the relationships that I have. It's my family, it's my friends, it's community, it's, life experience. So I think honestly, just reminding myself of that is actually pretty critical to maintaining a work-life balance. And you probably have all felt this. In academic spaces, there's a lot of pressure to perform, and there's a lot of achievement pressure. And people actually think it's like, like, ooh, did you see so-and-so sent that email at 2 a.m.? That's, in my opinion, I'm not sending emails at 2 a.m. and I actually don't need you to send me an email at 2 a.m. It's okay to be sleeping. And so I think there is a culture of over-performance. And it's very, I think, there's a lot of like, it's very easy to be drawn into that, I think, particularly if you're as a doctoral student or as a professional, you're with other generally high achieving professionals. So like the standard and the general culture is there. So I think just reminding yourself that that's even a value, because that's actually that question, Hannah, is not even a question everybody would ask, right? So like even recognizing that that's a value I have for myself, like I would like some sense of work-life balance, and then also realizing that that's elusive, right? Like what does balance mean? Sometimes you're going to not always get that. And I feel like there's also a lot of pressure to then, and particularly I will say with, I think if we think of like different gender norms, I think there's just there can be a lot of pressure related to like finding that perfect balance. And I think taking the pressure off of ourselves to even know what that is. But I will say, keeping in mind, like this is important to me. And then you just have to remind yourself. And I will be honest, there have been many times I have been alone in my office reminding myself of this, just to myself, just being like, these are my values. These are the things that are important to me. yes, I didn't do that paper, or no, I didn't drop this thing, or I decided to do this with my time instead of doing, this particular application. And then reminding myself, but that's important to me. And I want, at the end of this, at the end of my career, or at the end of when I went for tenure or whatever, that time's going to go by, and what do I want it to look like? And I don't want it to look like, I was basically I was just in my office all the time, just doing one thing. That just wouldn't feel very good.